Well, good evening. Welcome to Fundamental Freedoms. I'm Steve Burgess, and I'm broadcasting from my home in St. George, Utah.
I am David Sabine. I'm broadcasting from my home in Ontario.
So at Fundamental Freedoms, we're here to have good conversation. We believe that good conversation equals good society. We believe that you don't have to come to a conversation ready to do battle. It's okay to change your mind, and it is okay to have a lot of respect for the people that we disagree with.
You can find us online at Facebook, of course. Thank you for being here to watch. We also upload these videos to YouTube. That usually takes me a day or so. We also upload these videos and carry on some dialogue at fundamentalfreedoms.locals.com. And I'll put a link to that in our description below. Through the conversations that Steve and I have, we also try to abide two agreements that we made between us. One of the agreements is that we do our best to avoid undefined or non-specific they statements. So if we're talking about us and them, they, etc., we try to be very specific about who that is and the second agreement that we have made together is that we, and my mind is just drawing a blank right now, Steve. What's the second?
The second rule is that we represent ourselves, and our guest represents themselves. Yeah. So we're not here to speak on behalf of any organization or ideology. We're here to have a conversation one-on-one amongst the three of us.
And so we asked the same of our guests, and and tonight, so we have a friend of Steve's with us. Go ahead, Steve, and introduce Todd.
Todd Miller, a biologist with a pretty extensive background in human communication, and haven't seen Todd, I guess, face to face for several years, but he used to be a member of my church congregation, so we're good friends and knew his family, and just recently, throughout the last year or so, have run into him on social media several times as we posted and talked about some of the same subjects. And so thought with his background and some of his expertise, be a really interesting conversation tonight. So let's bring on Todd.
Todd, it's really nice to meet you. Welcome. Here you are. And for my benefit, because I don't know you as well as Steve does, maybe just if you'd love to share, please share a little bit about yourself and your background and maybe how it is that you're here with us tonight.
Sure. I'm from Utah originally. I've lived here most of my life. Met Steve, like he said, several years ago when I was going to school and working down in southern Utah. Now I live in northern Utah. While I was going to school, I was pretty indecisive as far as what I wanted to do with my life. So I went down a lot of different paths. I wound up getting 2 bachelor's degrees, one in human communication. I thought at one time of doing medical school. So I went back and did the prerequisites for medical school, which were all in the biology field. And I really loved that, changed course, finished my degree in biology, and went into wildlife biology from there.
And so then, currently, you're currently in the profession of wildlife biology, is that right?
Yeah, so I work as a wildlife biologist with an educational background in a variety of different biological fields. Getting a degree in biology, obviously there were courses in genetics, molecular biology, evolution, ecology, but then also, like I say, I also have a degree in human communication as well. So argumentation, critical thinking, rhetoric, things like that. So as Steve was talking on Facebook, spouting some of the things that Steve likes to spout, I had to pipe in every once in a while and set him straight on a few things, hopefully.
Cool. Well, we're going to start by posing our fundamental questions. Let Dave ask a question, then I'll ask a question, and then we'll just open it up to you and let you approach kind of answering those how you would like to, and we'll see where the conversation goes. So, David.
Yeah, sure. So my fundamental question for you, Todd, is please set me straight so that I understand the better of two options. Okay, one option is found in this community, it seems, of people online who think that herd immunity is achievable, it's real, it's what we are driving toward, it's what's inevitable, and so is that true of coronavirus as well? Is it true of this particular strain or future strains of this coronavirus, if you can predict? Or the other community that I'm seeing online seems to be quite the opposite, where I see hashtags like COVID-0 and no more waves and starve this virus, or whatever that means. There seems to be a community that thinks we can totally eradicate this, and that's what we should be doing. The other is, to me, and I'll be honest about my bias, I wear that on my sleeve, I think more pragmatically, there's probably a point where we achieve herd immunity, but I'm speaking as a layman. I really want to get set straight on which of these two options are possible, which of these options are perhaps better, which of these options should be in the zeitgeist, in your opinion. Over to Steve, by the way. So Steve and I will both pose these questions, and then Todd, it's up to you to just take the conversation wherever you want.
So I've thought a lot about this, and there's a million questions that I have, and hopefully we'll address a bunch of them as we talk. But as a fundamental question, I guess, and especially where you've got some interest and background in human evolution, as a human race, we were speaking earlier, and you were talking about the historical significance of this event. Aside from the other significance, just this is a big footnote in history, or will be, about the time the human race, was faced with the COVID-19 coronavirus. What if there was a way for us to be cohesive as a human race, which it seems like there's not, but what should be our goal as a human race as we tackle this challenge? What would, like, if you were emperor of the human race, in your opinion, what is the goal as we mitigate and look for options and create vaccines and stuff? What is the goal? And maybe that's similar to David's questions in some way, but anyway, that's where we'll start. So,
yeah, I think the two questions are pretty similar, in my mind, anyways, in my interpretation of it. I guess starting with David's question, herd immunity is, and maybe this answers Steve's too, herd immunity is the goal. How we achieve herd immunity is the question. So to define herd immunity is where there's enough individuals within a population that are functionally immune to whatever disease there is, to where the disease cannot spread, or at least not spread very easily. And there's two ways to achieve herd immunity. The one is through natural infection, where everybody gets sick with it. They catch it from their neighbor or their roommate or whatever. They get sick with it. And so then they just get their own naturally derived immunity that way. The other way to achieve herd immunity is through vaccination. So, Steve, to answer your question, the goal is to achieve herd immunity. Whether it's possible or not still remains to be seen. And I'm speaking personally. I had hopes that we could stamp out this virus months ago, not through herd immunity, but through effective mitigation. That's why, the first round of shutdowns back in April I was largely supportive of for a myriad of reasons, but with the goal that we can nip this in the bud. However, the virology of this particular virus proved to be really tricky and really advanced compared to what we've seen in other viruses, where it can spread undetected very easily. And so we weren't able to get our arms around it, and the cat's out of the bag at this point. So again, speaking as an individual, my own opinion, I think it's probably going to become endemic, meaning we're going to be dealing with it indefinitely in some capacity. What has been scary so far is, and what has caused a lot of concern is, at the beginning of this, based on what we knew at the beginning, there was no latent immunity, meaning there was no population that had any immunity to this. And so when you compare that to, say, influenza, last year a certain percentage of the population had influenza or received their flu shot. And so they had some degree of immunity to influenza. Now, influenza is a rapidly evolving virus. It's different than the coronavirus. So even from year to year, it can evolve to escape our immune defenses. But there's enough people from year to year that have some degree of immunity. So we can refer to that as latent immunity. It's an immunity that's sitting in the community. It's not enough to necessarily call it herd immunity, but it's a latent immunity. It offers protection. For COVID, for SARS-CoV-2, there was no immunity whatsoever. For our assumption at the beginning was everybody is susceptible to this virus. Now, later on, we did find that there's some evidence that there may be cross immunity from other coronaviruses for this, but we don't know the extent of that latent immunity. And so that's why it was so scary, because it was so transmissible. It transmits much more easily than influenza or other viruses that we typically deal with. It had a higher lethality rate, still does have a higher lethality rate than these other viruses that we're aware of. And we have no backup. There's no backstop. We're all susceptible to this. And so the law of large numbers, if, say, there's 3 million plus people in the state of Utah, if we all get sick, the hospital system's going to become overwhelmed, and that will drive up the death rate because people won't be able to get care. Here we saw that I think it was in Egypt, where they ran out of oxygen, supplemental oxygen, and the entire ICU wing of COVID patients died. And so we saw that in Italy. We saw that in New York in the early days of the pandemic, where these hospitals were getting overwhelmed, and therefore more people were dying because there was a lack of care. And so the concern level at the beginning especially was very, very, very high. And I think that's why we saw that stiff reaction from the government.
Yeah.
Can I ask a point of clarification? Sorry, Steve. So
yeah.
I want to be clear about what you said. I think you said the lethality rate. Mm-hmm. Is that the phrase you used? So
the lethality, the fatality and mortality rate, the percentage of people who die.
Right. So there seems to be a lot of different, let's say, okay, there's a broad way or a general way to look at those data points, and then there's specific ways. So the specific data points tell us, I think, that younger populations rarely have serious reactions to this and pull through with minimal difficulty, and very few fatalities in people younger than 20, few younger than 50, a little more, in the age. So as we get older, obviously it gets more lethal. But so when you say that this has a higher lethality than other viruses, are you talking about, it's 2.6% as, from age 0 to 80 or 95? Or are you saying, what are you saying specifically?
Well, so I was referencing the beginning of the pandemic, where not only did we lack a lot of information, but we actually had incorrect information that we were given from China.
Yeah, 3.8%, I remember, or 3.85%, I remember in the news.
And it was even higher than that if you looked at the number of confirmed COVID cases and the number of confirmed COVID deaths. For a minute there, it was hovering around 10%
Yeah, scary
total.
stuff.
So the number of people who we knew had it compared to the number of people who were dying from it was about 10%.
What is the best recent figure that you work with in your thinking about this current problem? What's the figure you have in mind?
So as you mentioned, it is extremely stratified by age group. So just for the general public, from, like you said, 0 to 100, worldwide, we're probably, in my best guess from what I've seen, about 0.6%.
Now, for
fatality
example,
rate.
thank you. So for you, for example, do you trust the information from CDC? Because they seem to have some information about this. They've updated it a couple of times, once in August, once in September, showing, younger than 19 years of age, the fatality rate among people that have contracted COVID was like 0.0003, 0.0003. So that's 0.003%.
Right.
So do you look at CDC's numbers? And if I were to look at CDC's numbers, is this something I can say those are accurate? That's quite real. That's representative of global.
Yes, I do. Believe, to use your words, believe the CDC. I look at their data somewhat. Living in Utah, I tend to pay more attention to more local numbers than the CDC numbers. But yes, I do believe they do. But you've got to also understand how they're arriving at that number. And it's the same way that we arrived at the 10% number early on, is they've got to look at the hard data that they have. They can't really guess. And so they kind of use a combination of confirmed cases and serology data, where they do surveillance serology, which is they will go out and just randomly sample people's blood and look for antibodies to the coronavirus. And then they'll be able to extrapolate from there. Okay, this percent of the population has actually had COVID, even though we've only had this percent that has actually tested positive. And so combining that data together, you can come up with a decently accurate number. And so that I think the CDC is an excellent resource, to put it bluntly.
And thank you. So I asked for clarification there and got it. Sorry, Steve, over to you.
No, I just wanted to rewind just a little bit. So when we talk about herd immunity, is that how you would describe like polio? So polio is a virus, right? And I mean, we've got 8 billion people in the world, and you could count on your fingers and toes a lot of years the number of cases we see of polio, like it's statistically almost non-existent. And so is that where that amount of control and just immunity, and that immunity, because, well, we've been pretty successful at eradicating polio for a lot of years, so not a lot of people get naturally exposed to polio, almost zero people. And so that herd immunity was really achieved and is being maintained essentially with vaccines, right?
Yes. So does that translate directly to SARS-CoV-2? I would say no.
Okay.
The principles may translate, but SARS-CoV-2 is a very different animal from the polio virus.
Sorry, when you say animal, do you mean that? In fact, that's one of the things I've wondered, because we had a guest on not long ago who referred to this as a particle, and was adamant that it is not alive. And this is maybe another question I would love to flesh out. And don't let this tangent take us away right now unless you can answer it quickly, but this is something I'd like to understand.
There is and has been debate amongst biologists for generations as to whether or not viruses are considered living organisms.
Okay.
So I saw where he said that, and his answer, his description is a perfectly valid line of thinking.
Okay.
Depending on how you define life, viruses may or may not be considered technically alive.
Okay, so you said this was a different animal than polio, and carry on.
Yeah, so speaking kind of metaphorically, I guess, a different animal than polio. Um, and one thing I learned in all of my studies with biology, there are virtually no rules that don't have an exception. So if you say, is it possible that this and this and this could happen? The answer is almost always yes when it comes to biology. The famous line from Jurassic Park, life finds a way. It is amazing how life can find a way, can adapt and overcome challenges to find a way. So when we look at SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus, compared to polio, there's so many different different factors that can play into how this plays out down the road. The transmissibility, the duration of immunity, how many people are willing to get the vaccine, and our starting point. When we started with the polio vaccine, polio was running along at its regular rate. In other words, we had some latent immunity, kind of like what I was speaking to before with influenza. We had been living with polio for a long time. The coronavirus is operating on a blank canvas. It can run wild, and we've seen it run wild. So the timeline of the polio vaccine development and the timeline of the coronavirus development also play a role in how things may turn out in the end. So to say, what we did with polio is what we can do with coronavirus is a bigger stretch than I'm willing to make. I think we can control it somewhat. And also, our vectors for infection. Coronavirus is a respiratory infection, highly contagious respiratory infection. And so I can see it taking years before we get rid of coronavirus, if we ever do indeed get rid of coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. It's going to be with us for a while. Is it going to be with us like it is right now? No. Hopefully we're just a few months away from getting it at least under control to where our hospitals can manage the more severe cases, and everybody else can kind of just, you get it, and then, or hopefully you get the vaccine, and then you don't have to worry about it for at least a few years.
Can I ask too, because I had a recent conversation with a neighbor, and they mentioned Spanish flu. And so there's a lot of comparison online, and I think a lot of weird information. I've tried to parse through it. The best I can come up with is this, and I think it relates to your comment here, that we're going to have to learn to live with it. So Spanish flu, my understanding is that its official name was H1N1 influenza A, and there are numerous strains that have evolved and carry on throughout our population always. Spanish flu is still with us. Is that an accurate or not accurate statement? And maybe that's...
I would say no.
Okay. So maybe Spanish flu, the original strain, is not with us?
Well, it has evolved to the point to where it's no longer recognizable as what we would think of as the Spanish flu.
Okay, good. Okay, so because it evolved, and it did so in an environment where we did not have vaccination, we didn't have the kinds of treatments we do now. So to Steve's question, and to your answer, you said, well, this is a very different animal than polio, but is it reasonable to think that 10 years down the road, we're just having new strains of COVID-19, whatever their names are, and they sort of propagate, a few people get ill, a few people die tragically, I'm sorry, each year, just the same way that we do, people die each year of some strain of H1N1. Is that an accurate future? Is that a realistic future? Is that a future we can even avoid?
Well, that last part, avoidance, is where I think we may have, and this is again my personal opinion, where I think the cat's out of the bag to avoid a future similar to that at least. But this is a very different animal from the Spanish flu, from influenza.
Okay.
It's much more contagious, and especially these variants that we're seeing out of the UK and South Africa. And I was just hearing that there were a new variant discovered today in the United States, in Ohio, are much more contagious. What we typically see, and this makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint, is viruses will evolve to become more contagious but less dangerous. Because you think about what a virus wants, and I hate to use the term want because it doesn't have conscious thought. But if you look at the way it behaves, which again, it doesn't have conscious thought, but it does behave in a certain way. What it wants is to propagate. And so it wants to be more contagious, but if it kills its host, then it's no longer going to propagate from that host. So the strains and the varieties that are more deadly, usually with most viruses, they die out over time. Literally, they die out over time, unfortunately, because they kill their hosts, more likely than not.
Is there any indication currently, is there any indication currently that these new strains have negated that pattern, or are they following that pattern of evolution?
It's hard to say because it's so new. And I know for a lot of people that I've talked to, they get frustrated because they say, gosh, it's been 10 months and we're still going. 10 months is nothing when it comes to a pandemic, a plague, whatever you want to call it, throughout human history. These things stretch on for years. Spanish flu stretched on for 2+ years, 2.5 years. So it hasn't, we haven't seen it yet. But like I say, with these new variants that are more contagious, but preliminarily not more dangerous, you can maybe see that's a first step. The other thing to consider is with this, it evolved, or it mutates much more slowly than an influenza virus, for example. Some of the research that I've read about these new strains in the UK and in South Africa, they believe that they may have come from a single immunocompromised person in South Africa and in the UK who had it, but did not have the immune system to get rid of it. And we've seen this in case studies stateside as well, where they test positive for the disease for more than a month, for 40+ days. They have active spreadable coronavirus, but these are not just your average people. These are, like I said, immunocompromised people. So they don't have an immune system to get rid of the virus. And so the virus, what it's doing inside their bodies, it's just replicating. It replicates and replicates and replicates and replicates. And that's what drives evolution, is replication. Okay. I'm not going to sprout wings, but over the course of generations and generations and generations, my lineage could theoretically sprout wings. And so the
someone who has it for that sustained time, because there's so many repetitions in that same body, just more opportunity statistically for mutations and changes.
Yes. So mutations are completely random. It's not something the virus does on purpose.
Right.
It's not something that the DNA does on purpose. In fact, our bodies have very complex systems, and most living organisms do have very complex systems to prevent mutations from happening. But sometimes they slip through. But they're entirely random, and the vast majority of them don't do a thing. They don't change anything. It's just the genetic code gets changed. But it oftentimes is in a portion of the sequence that doesn't change anything, doesn't affect anything. Okay. But when you're able to just replicate inside a single person, time after time after time after time, that's where we see big changes happening, and that's what we saw in the UK and in South Africa.
So let me bring up two points. These are totally divergent, but so one that I think we might get along with about, and you can just confirm, and you might like me, and the other one that we'll see what your reaction is. So just I'd love to address some of these internet meme, low resolution kind of ideas that are floating around that seem to gain traction a lot. One is you'll see just a lot of like blowing smoke through a mask, the COVID particle is so much smaller than the particles of this smoke, and look how the smoke just runs through the mask unabated. And so my understanding of that is, if a COVID particle is a mosquito, your mask is a chain link fence, and it's like you're not going to stop mosquitoes with a chain link fence. However, the mosquitoes are sitting on gobs of your spit or saliva, and the spit molecules are a lot more like the size of a basketball. And so we're not trying to stop the mosquitoes, we're trying to stop the basketballs that the mosquitoes are riding on. And the reality is, it doesn't stop those mosquitoes 100%. They can still go out the sides of your mask and still escape, obviously, but it just overall chops the distance that those travel, or the propagation of that. It keeps a high percentage close to your mouth. Is that how to think about masks generally, like as a layman?
Yes, and I'll add some more to it. And also, I would say that you may have taken it even too far.
Okay.
With your basketball comparison. So, but first, let me introduce the idea of an inoculum and the idea of LD50. Are you familiar with LD50? Have you heard that term before?
I haven't.
So it stands for lethal dose 50% of a population. So what scientists do with viruses in particular, but with other pathogens as well, is they will take a group of lab rats, because we can't do this on people, it's highly unethical, but they will take a group of lab rats and they will expose them to different amounts of a virus. And you get what's called the LD50, is the amount of virus that is required to kill 50% of that population of lab rats. And that is the inoculum. That's the amount of virus that it takes to be lethal for 50% of the population again. So the amount of virus matters that you are inoculated with. That's the inoculum. Your exposure matters. If you get exposed to a lot of viral particles, you are much more likely to have a severe disease than if you only get a few. And that could be why we see so many asymptomatic cases, is because people are wearing their masks, they are staying socially distant. It's not going to eliminate the transmission of this virus, but it can minimize the transmission and it can reduce the severity of the transmission. So when you look at masks, your comparison of mosquitoes and basketballs is a good starting point, but not all respiratory droplets are the same size. So I would probably say you've got a big bucket. Let's say mosquitoes are your viral particles and your chain link fence is your cloth mask. You got a big bucket, and within the bucket there's some marbles, there's some golf balls, there's some baseballs, there's some basketballs, there's some beach balls. And those are the different respiratory droplets sizes that you've got. You produce different sizes. There's a range of respiratory droplet sizes. And so your mask, it's going to catch all the beach balls. It's going to catch all the basketballs. It's going to catch, probably all the baseballs, most of the golf balls. And it's going to get some of the marbles and deflect some of the marbles. So what is getting through is a very low dose. So it's not stopping it entirely. So the people who say, that mask, well, I won't get into a they thing, but it's not going to stop it entirely, but it will reduce the inoculum that you're exposed to, particularly if you're also wearing a mask, because then it has to travel through your mask as well. But also you got to think about the physics behind it, where you see those videos of blowing smoke or vaping through a mask, and you see all that smoke and vapor just kind of pooling around the face and falling down. Is it coming through the mask? Yes. But you and I, we've seen people vape. When people vape, that thing shoots 3-4 feet out in front of them. But you don't see that when you're wearing a mask and you try to vape. In fact, if you hold a candle in front of your face, I just tried this the other day to prove a point to my wife. If you hold a candle in front of your face with a mask on and you try to blow it out, you can't do it. So does that mean we're all suffocating? No, the air is exchanging through that mask, but it's severely reducing the velocity of the particles that are getting through, not to mention capturing the majority of the particles that are in there. So transmission can still occur wearing a mask.
So
but
that's
it's much less.
that's interesting. I want to just explore and understand this LD50 concept. So
Okay.
because I think a lot of people look at COVID in a binary way. I either have it or I don't have it. I mean, I would say that's how I think of it up until you said that, because I said, well, how would they test that? Because COVID only has a mortality rate of 0.6% on average. So if you put a bunch of people in a room and pump COVID into it, even if all of them get COVID, you're never going to get anywhere near to a 50% mortality rate to achieve that LD50 number. But what you're saying is you put people, I mean, you could essentially pump enough virus particles into a closed space to essentially kill everyone in the room if it was that concentrated and that prolonged of exposure. Is that, I mean, I know that's maybe not perfect science or whatever, but it's very sensitive then to the amount of exposure you receive.
Yes, obviously that's in theory, because we obviously can't try it on
Right.
humans, but we can try it on lab rats, and that's what we do. So I'll compare it. I'll do some biology shop talk with you, which for some people can be a little bit much, but I think you guys can handle it. So you think of, for example, fertilizing an egg with sperm. How many sperm does it take to fertilize an egg? It's just one. So why do we devote so many resources into producing tens of millions of sperm, if not hundreds of millions of sperm? It's because the chances of any one sperm making it there are pretty slim. Okay, in order to be infected with coronavirus, you need to be exposed to a certain amount, because if it's just a single viral particle coming at you, the chances of it causing an infection are very, 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 very low. I mean, basically zero. It would have to be the miracle of all miracles for a single viral particle to infect you with coronavirus. Theoretically possible, but it'd be like trying to get somebody pregnant with a single sperm cell.
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen. And so if we can reduce that exposure, it'll also give our immune system a chance to fight it, so that we have less severe symptoms. If we even, we could even avoid infection altogether if we can get it low enough. That's why masking isn't the only thing. You can't just wear a mask and think you're good. You've also got to stay 6 feet apart, because the majority of these respiratory particles drop before 6 feet. That does not mean all of them. They can be airborne for even up to hours at a time, but it's very few and it's very dilute. That's why if you're outside, it's better than inside, because it has a chance to become more dilute in the air. So there's a number of factors. It's the Swiss cheese approach, if you've heard of that, where if you look at a slice of Swiss cheese, it's got lots of holes in it, but if you slap a second piece on there, some of those holes are going to be covered up, but some of them you'll still be able to go through. So then you put another piece of Swiss cheese on top of that, and more holes are covered up. And by the time you get 4 or 5 pieces thick, there's no more holes. So that's what coronavirus mitigation efforts are. You can't just do any one thing, because then you're going into battle with a single piece of Swiss cheese. You're not going to get very far. But if you can stack them on top of each other, that's where you really start to have success and make a difference in preventing transmission and or reducing severity of disease.
So I've got a whole other line of reasoning, but let me give David a chance to jump in.
Well, Steve, I was going to maybe change course a little bit, and because there's a lot of questions I have here for Todd about the human response. I don't mean the biological response, I mean societal response to what's going on. I don't know what your comment was going to be. Maybe you should continue on this line for now, if that's where you were going to stay.
I was going to diverge.
Okay, so let's
epically diverge. So
yeah,
you go ahead.
So there's a lot more I'd love to know about its biology and its evolution, and please bring that up when you want. But I have this question now. So what if we start stacking up this Swiss cheese, and what ends up happening is we absolutely suffocate humanity under all those mitigation efforts. And so I'd like to maybe change course a bit and ask you about so I'm going to assume you're in favor of masking, you're in favor of social distancing, and I don't know if you're in favor yet of our government making that so-called law, or if you'd rather that be done through education and just individual responsibility. You could speak to that if you want. But what I'm after here is we're seeing these myriad policy changes happening throughout North America and the world, frankly. Are there any measures that you think have been crazy, overboard or wrong, or I think there are many instances that have gone completely nuts, and but I'd love to hear your perspective about that, and maybe concretely, is there a circumstance or an age category where you disagree with masking? In schools, outdoors, indoors, younger than 5, younger than 12, I don't know.
There's a lot there.
Yeah. Take this wherever you wish, because I think what I'm asking, Steve, I'd like to kind of go down this road of mitigation efforts, their impact, the negative and positive of those impacts.
So I think it's a giant risk-benefit analysis. If we purely focus on the epidemiology, we will destroy the world. If we do what it would really take in order for us to eradicate this virus, which we could eradicate this virus theoretically within a month, it could be gone from off the face of the earth. But in order to do that, the cost would be way too high. On the other hand, allowing the virus to propagate, well, that creates costs of its own, because you see individual people exercising their individual liberties to say, nope, the case counts are too high, I'm not going to the store today, or I'm not going to that store because I don't feel safe there. They don't have a mask policy, so I don't feel safe going there. And so there's economic impacts there as well. So it is a giant risk-benefit analysis, and there is no easy answer, in my opinion. I'm not an economist. I have appreciated the way, I know that in Utah, our leadership has gotten some well-deserved criticism, but I think there's been a lot of over-the-top criticism as well. The question I keep coming back to is, what would you have done differently? Knowing what we knew at the time.
Concrete examples? Like concrete examples,
sure.
Things you've agreed with, things you've disagreed with?
Well, something that I love that recently just came out, in the state of Utah, again, that's kind of what I've looked at the most. So that's what I'll speak to. I know we're speaking to a wider audience than Utah. But they recently, in talking about vaccine distribution, they have said, we are discouraging anybody who has had coronavirus naturally within the last 90 days. You should not get the vaccine. And that's the first elected official. Our governor was the first elected official I have seen anywhere say that. And I think that is a stroke of genius in this moment, because vaccine supplies are limited. And so we want to do the greatest amount of goods. We want to get it to the greatest amount of susceptible people, meaning if you've had COVID lately, you don't have to worry. Reinfection is possible, but it's very rare, at least so far. And so I think that was a great thing. But going back over time, over the course of the pandemic, we've recently changed governors. We had an election, so we've got a new governor. Our previous governor, he couldn't say anything without half the population getting real mad at him. And I could sympathize. When I was a young man in my early college days, I was asked to umpire a baseball tournament. And I played baseball a little bit as a kid, but I'm not huge into baseball, but I was a warm body who was able to do this. And it struck me at the time, the lesson I learned is no matter what call I made, half the people in the stands were angry with me. There was no way to appease everybody. And so when you look at what has been mandated, what hasn't been mandated, when it was mandated, Utah has taken, I think, a much more hands-off approach. As far as a mask mandate wasn't implemented until November. We did have a lockdown in April, but that was lifted, I believe, May 1st, the hardcore lockdown. And then by June 1st, I think it was pretty much entirely lifted and has been since then. But you contrast that.
Sorry, have you had a second wave of
Oh, yeah.
cases? Yeah. So okay.
Huge. Where we are right now is way worse than where we were during the first lockdown.
Even in terms of
Oh, yeah.
fatalities, or just in terms of cases?
Even especially in terms of fatalities.
Well,
Yeah, so the fatality percentage has dropped. But to me, that doesn't really mean anything because it's number of people that are dying. We want to make that number as small as possible. I don't care what the percentage is. I want to know how many people, how many lives can we save? And so the number of people that have died has spiked, not as high proportionally as the number of cases. So we are finding more effective ways to treat this.
and so businesses have been able to carry on though, and people are employed. Is there, like here in Canada, particularly in Ontario, we're seeing reports of, like the Canadian Mental Health Association, just I think 2 weeks ago, wrote an open letter to say that they're seeing terrible things. Let's say there was an increase in the first month of lockdown in Ontario. There was an increase of 1,300 and I'm going to get this number wrong, but 1,345% increase in head traumas among children. Because the tensions in the households are through the roof. Overdoses, suicides are way up. These 10,000 restaurants across Canada never will reopen again. I'd love to hear. Maybe Utah has been different. So if you can speak to outside of those borders, what you've seen and what sorts of concrete examples of policies that you've agreed or disagreed with, or that you thought went too far or didn't go far enough, or just the human communication around this and what's going on societally that you've found troublesome or interesting.
Sure. So, I mean, I'm not trying to say Utah has done it perfectly by any stretch, or even that they've done it the best.
Yeah.
But like I said earlier, there is a huge cost-benefit analysis that these elected officials have to consider, and the weight of those decisions I can't even fathom, because there are no easy answers. If you keep everything wide open, the virus will proliferate, and that will affect the economy. Because like I mentioned, if people are sick, they're going to be much less likely to engage with the economy. Or if they're afraid of becoming sick, they're going to be much less likely to engage with the economy. There was a study put out by, I believe it was the University of Utah, that's been cited many times, that shows economic activity increases with mask mandates and with other public health mitigation efforts. Obviously, to a certain point, if you're shutting down the economy, then all of a sudden that turns around.
Yeah,
but
that's
when
the
people
case here.
feel,
Sorry
Right.
to interrupt you, but that is the case here. It's just businesses are shutting down all over the place.
Yeah, and certainly there are businesses closing in Utah. There are businesses that can't survive the pandemic, but it seems to be, I hope, I'm not a business guy, I'm not an economist by any means, but just from what I've seen, it seems to be somewhat less because we have had a less restrictive environment. But it's been interesting to note the criticism that the governor has received over the year for even the restrictions that he has put in place. And some of it I just find absolutely absurd and silly.
Example?
And for businesses as well. So for a mask mandate, for example, my wife works in retail. I won't mention which store, but she works in retail, and they had a mask mandate from the beginning. Before any government did, before anybody even knew the real benefit to masks. You'll remember there was some confusion early on as to whether masks were actually helpful or not, before anybody knew any of that. her company implemented a mask mandate in their stores,
Mm-hmm.
and she still to this day gets grief from customers about it. And to me, it's a no-win situation, but you're making matters worse when you won't do the simplest mitigation to try to find the sweetest of spots that we can find. There's not a sweet spot, but there's a spot that's sweeter than the rest, and that is balancing effective mitigations with maintaining the economy as open as we can. There's things we can do that keep the economy open, that keep businesses open, that will help reduce. We're never going to eliminate, but we can reduce the amount of transmission. So wearing your mask, staying 6 feet apart, washing your hands, staying home if you're sick, getting tested if you're sick, or if you've been exposed to somebody, because we know asymptomatic spread is a big deal with this virus. So if we can do those things individually, those things don't harm the economy, in my opinion.
Okay,
so let's do them.
You've just said something that is different than information I've seen. Asymptomatic spread, you said, is high.
Yeah. So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll have to form this. So my understanding is that asymptomatic spread among, let's say people under 40 is not a problem. We have, for example, a medical expert here in my local area who, in fact, just has been lambasted online for saying this out loud, but last weekend he said we should be getting children back in schools. In fact, we've seen cases rise among children since we sent them home before the Christmas holiday. We should be getting them back in school. This lockdown and keeping kids home from school isn't that's antithetical to what I see in these data. These data tell me that they're safer in schools. We have better mitigation and more, let's say, more discipline around mitigation in the school environment. Kids are contracting it in their home more often than they're contracting it in their school. It's spreading from the home to the school and not the other way around generally. So, and we've like the World Health Organization published or said in May or June that asymptomatic spread is not really their concern. And then if you remember, the woman who said that the next day had to roll it back. Maybe she was told to clarify this point or whatever. So there seems to be a lot of mixed information about asymptomatic spread. And what's your best data that I should read?
Okay, so again, there's a lot there. So let me start with this, going back to what the WHO said and then unsaid several months ago, and that is the evolution of our knowledge of this virus. So again, even a year is not enough time to really understand something as complex as a virus and how a virus operates within a population, a brand new virus. So we really need to take with a grain of salt the things that those early scientists were saying. The other thing I'll say, which I mentioned earlier, scientists are horrible communicators. And the people in communication, your media members, are horrible scientists. And so we were kind of playing the telephone game, that we played as kids, where information is getting passed along, but the people who then are passing that information along don't understand the information that they're passing along, and so they're not doing a very good job. And then it's getting to people who have no idea what epidemiology is. They've never heard of a coronavirus before this year, who are then expecting people who have spent a decade or more in graduate school and in their professional field studying epidemiology, studying viruses and coronaviruses. They then say, well, explain it to me because I don't understand. And that's just impossible, and it's an unfair task to put on public health officials. When I say that, I mean epidemiologists, particularly in this instance. At some point, their knowledge that they've gained, you're going to have to go through the process that they went through to get to where they're at. They can try their best to explain it to you in a way you'll understand, but like I said, they're not great communicators. So at some point, we've got to take at least some of what they say with a grain of salt. That doesn't mean we just need to do whatever they say. That doesn't mean we can't question that. That doesn't mean we can't have those conversations. But we need to cut them some slack, particularly when it's a brand new virus that we've never seen before. And the entire world is now watching what Dr. Fauci, for example, says about a virus that he knows very, very, very little about. Not only that, but a lot of the information that he knew at the beginning was actually wrong information that he got from China. And so then to hold him 8 months later to things he was saying back in March or February is just completely unfair. Information evolves rapidly, very, very rapidly. And so even things that we thought or that we believed or that they were saying a month ago may no longer be valid because some study has come out and refuted that. So, and this is where scientists get into trouble. They make scientific guesses, educated guesses that other scientists understand kind of what you mean when you say it probably does this or it probably does that. So when Dr. Fauci said at the beginning, masks probably are not very effective, he said this in February or early March, masks are probably not very effective in preventing this disease. He was making a guess based on what he knew from other viruses, other similar viruses, that previous studies showed masks, cloth masks anyways, don't make a big difference. So then what did they do? They started studying specifically coronavirus and cloth masks. And they found, hey, you know what? These masks actually make a lot bigger difference than we thought. They're actually probably the most important tool we have right now before we can get a vaccine. They're a really important tool. So maybe we should be wearing masks. And so then and then people call out Dr. Fauci for lying or for deceiving when he was operating, making his educated guesses the best way he could with the information he had at the time. But it changed. And something like this, where again, the entire world's watching, there's a lot of pressure on these people who are not used to being in front of cameras, who are not used to being in front of the public. They're used to speaking with other epidemiologists. They're used to speaking with other experts in the field, not the general public. And that's where they get themselves into trouble. Going back to schools, and asymptomatic spread, why are schools safer for kids? It's because of all those mitigation efforts. I mean, at least in Utah, I don't know how it is everywhere else, but in Utah, kids have to wear masks. I'm sure universally there's an element of social distancing. So getting kids in school, in my opinion, is important. To me, the risks are less than the benefits because of the things you mentioned of domestic violence, and not to mention just kids falling behind. But so I think public schools should be offered universally. However, if you're living in a household that has a high-risk individual and you're able to do homeschooling with your kids, now might be a good time to consider doing that, at least for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
But going back to asymptomatic spread isn't necessarily just in kids. We see asymptomatic spread throughout the age groups. And in fact, the CDC said recently that about 60% of the new infections that we're seeing is coming from somebody who is asymptomatic, or at least pre-symptomatic. And so that makes exposure testing important. If you've been exposed to somebody who has COVID, you should go get tested because you can have it. And I've known many people who have had it and had no idea they had it. They got it because they were going to take a flight somewhere or they were going in for surgery or whatever. So they got tested. You tested positive, and then they tested again. I know somebody who took the test 3 times because she was so incredulous that she could have actually had it. She kept getting tested because she felt totally fine. And yet she was contagious and able to transmit it. So the majority of the infections that are happening now are from asymptomatic spread. So it is a critical component to how this virus spreads. is through asymptomatic spread.
So if I can, I want to try and draw just a really big circle around kind of a macro economic, macro socio kind of idea. So, and I'm going to make a bunch of assumptions. I'm going to try and oversimplify this for the sake of conversation. So let's have an academic discussion about this. In the United States, uh, I did a lot of research. The most research I've done personally has been on excess deaths, because I think that it's like, if anybody wants to, because it seems like there's over here, you've got this extreme faction saying the virus is made up, it doesn't even exist, it's complete fiction. And then you've got, people over here saying it's the apocalypse. And so I'm like, well, the best way to look at that is, are more people dying this year? Did more people die in 2020 than died in 2019, and by what percentage? And as I researched that, the growth in the number of deaths in the United States is approaching, or has been approaching slowly, 2 million per year, for the last several years. And what struck me was that it's an extremely narrow corridor. Like, it doesn't vary from year to year more than usually less than 0.5%. Like, it doesn't, when you take all of the factors, I mean, it spikes during flu season and certain times of the year, and accidents and natural, unnatural, all of that. But what was fascinating was, you take this country of 350 million people, it's very consistently just under 2 million people. And so it's 1.85, 1.9, and it's growing, but growing because it's growing with population as the population grows. Based on that, we should have been in 2020 somewhere between 1.95 million and 2 million people. Like, that would have been what you would expect to see from the CDC complete death toll numbers. What we've seen, and not all the numbers are perfect yet, but it's close now, it's about 2.3 million. And so there are, and that's what you see on CNN and Fox News every day, plastered on the boards or whatever, 315,000 deaths, 330,000 deaths, whatever, growing from that 250,000 number that it was back in the fall. And it's like, well, that's the excess deaths. And you can say, well, mitigation efforts have caused more suicides, and so some of those are that, and they misdiagnosed COVID, or they're calling things COVID deaths that aren't COVID deaths. But to me, all of that noise, you can basically set that aside and say it's somewhere between 250 and 350. I mean, like, a layman can look at those numbers, put the spreadsheet together, highlight it, and just use Excel, and it's not complicated to see 300,000 too many people have died in 2020. And that's about 15%. So when you talk about a statistic that never varies more than about 0.5% or 1%, to have a 15% spike in a year is a extremely significant event. Now, in Utah, the numbers are, it's hard to pin it down precisely, but in Utah, my gut, looking at the numbers I've looked at, it's more like 10%. I don't think we're as high as the national average. In Canada, I'm thinking that's more like 4 or 5% is what the numbers are going to bear out in 2020. That's still a significant spike, but not nearly as much as it was in the US, And so you you look at Canada with a population of 30 million, and just less than 1% of those people die every year, because people don't live normally past 100 years old. And so you expect 300,000 people to die, right, every year in Canada. And if you have a 5% spike due to COVID primarily, then what's that? Somebody help me with the math. 15,000 people.
15,000, yeah. That's
so
not what we've seen in Canada, though. So
what's that?
That's not what we've seen here in Canada. In Canada, the total deaths so far this year are just a few thousand more than what it was in 2018. Now, 2018, we did have an influenza. There was news about influenza in that year, I remember. But 2020 is not dramatically different. It's slightly higher. And but I wonder, back to your statistics here. Are you taking into account? Okay, carry on. Let's finish that. Go on.
Let's finish that point, because that's I mean, so say it's less than 5%. I mean, it was 2% or whatever. Canada's lockdowns and mitigation efforts were, I would say, draconian compared to most places in the U.S., especially compared to a state like Utah, which was pretty mild in their approach compared to a lot of other states, in my opinion.
There's two other factors, though, that I'd like for you to, and maybe you did take these into account, but one factor would be just baby boomers are now reaching the age of expected, what's it called here? Life expectancy, okay? The other is at some point in our recent past, 10, 20, 25 years ago, there were new regulations around do not resuscitate orders. So, for example, here in Ontario, a lot of the deaths were in long-term care facilities where, these folks are 80, 85, 91 years old and have DNRs, and we don't know, maybe they would have survived if they would have been resuscitated, and we don't know. But did you take into account, for example, the baby boomer generation now reaching life expectancy and other policies like that?
No, respectfully, I think that's reaching a little bit. I mean, that certainly could account. Baby boomers. I mean, our death rate is probably going to climb a little bit, but I mean, the baby boomer generation is 30 years wide, and so I mean, you're going to see that spike up slowly over time and then crescendo down or whatever. But I mean, I think a much bigger factor would be like population density. To say as something as simple as, well, Canada did it right. They locked down, decimated their economy, and they don't have a whole lot of excess deaths, versus the United States are gun-toting American free-for-all cowboys and didn't do near as good on the mitigation, and they have this 15% spike in their total death count for the year. And so I think population density has a ton to do with it, but here's the question. Say you had 20,000 excess deaths, right? Or 15, 20,000. And say if you had experienced more similar to the United States, that number would have been 60. And this is my question for both of you, is in a country of 30 million people like in Canada, is the experiences that you've had the last year, the overarching results of the mitigation efforts, were they worth, and I know this is terribly theoretical and terribly oversimplified, were they worth 40,000 untimely deaths saved? I mean, because that's I mean, when you, like, people talk about, well, the science, you got to follow the science, and I like Todd mentioned it. He said, if you just looked at epidemiology and that's the only scientific method or approach you used, well, yeah, we could eradicate it in a month, and we would also eradicate everything else good about humanity at the same time, But so epidemiology is a science, economics is a science, statistics is a science, humanities, arts, and I mean, those other disciplines are also important sciences too. And so that's all the results of the mitigation efforts, the economic fallout, the social unrest, the political divisiveness that's happened, the slowing down of kids' progression in schools, all of that on one side of the scale. And Canada, for instance, if that's even reality, put on the other side of the scale 40,000 people who could have lived another 10, 20, 30 years. is, and I don't know how, to me, I think we missed it at the beginning. We should have been having that discussion 10 months ago or 12 months ago. And instead, our politicians predominantly took short-term measures, and we had most people come out and go, well, we're going to try this for 2 weeks. We're going to do this for 1 month, and hopefully we'll be able to open up. And I mean, all the mitigation efforts, the lockdown or whatever we had in Utah was 8 months too early. There was almost no COVID to be seen in Utah, and now we're seeing, the cat out of the bag, like Todd said. Sorry, we've got a guest here, and we've hasn't said much.
I'm just a fly on the wall. You two keep going. I think you're right, Steve. When we did our lockdown in Utah, and people complain about this, and they say this is why it doesn't make sense, because it's so much worse now than it was when we were in lockdown, and they're right. The thing to keep in consideration with that, and sorry, that was a vague they statement. It's just something I've heard said. Mm-hmm. But something to keep in mind is we, as a country, did a horrific job at the very beginning of this thing with our surveillance. Our testing was pathetically slow. And that's why I think that's what led to the lockdown. Wasn't because everybody was saying this is hyper dangerous. It was more a lockdown based on the unknown. We didn't know how widespread it was. We didn't know how dangerous it was because we didn't know how widespread it was. So we were seeing people dying. We saw freezer trucks in New York and in Italy before that. And that scared us because we didn't know where this virus was. Why didn't we know? Because we had such poor testing regimens put in place early on. And so the only thing we could do was, well, since we can't test everybody, everybody stay home. And really the United States didn't lock down nearly as much as some of these other countries. It sounds like Canada has been much more severe in their lockdowns. The continuing lockdowns. So that's why I say I supported the lockdown at the time, and going back, if I knew, if I had to go back and was somehow a decision maker, I probably would have elected to do a lockdown because, like I say, we were completely flying in the dark, but we knew the potential that this thing had to wreak havoc.
Okay, but present tense,
But present tense, the continuing lockdowns, I got a big problem with.
Okay, why?
Because we can manage it as well as we can with a lockdown without having to do a lockdown. Mm-hmm. And it's just so simple, and it's why I don't understand the resistance to wearing a mask and to social distancing, and to getting tested. If you have any reason to suspect you have it, asymptomatically or not, go get tested.
Okay. Yeah, I like where that's going.
I can explain the resistance to masks. So when if I had this conversation, and I know that a lot of the information didn't exist and wasn't available in as nearly as much perspective 10 months ago, but if I had the conversation, and that's why you're kind of an amazing person with this. You're a scientist who can also talk. It's like a computer nerd that can communicate with the real world. It's like kind of a miracle. And so you're explaining things to me, and it's like, you know what, that makes some sense. And I don't, when I hear that, and it says, so would you wear a mask? Yeah. I mean, I don't look at it as a punitive or some form of mass control. I look at it as kind of common sense, maybe. But if it's mandated, then I feel this responsibility. I don't know where it comes from. Maybe I am just a monster with no regard for human decency. But I feel this innate need to be like, somebody has to provide the dissent. If everyone just says, okay, that's what we need to do, then we'll just do that. And I don't want to be shamed. I don't want to be singled out. I don't want to be the lone wolf or whatever. So I'll just go along. And then it's mandated by the government, like, you better believe you will. All of a sudden, I switch and I'm like, I kind of want to be that one single person in Walmart who doesn't have their mask on. So that people are
Yeah.
like, well, it's still like life without a mask still potentially exists. Like,
Right.
I don't know. It's just,
Yeah, there's some additional context there. So as soon as like I bought masks in last February, and was wearing them downtown Toronto to make, because that seemed logical, and it matched the information I was hearing. But you're right, when it became a mandate, I thought, politicians are right now behaving as though the science is settled. They're behaving as though that this question is now answered and that they're making public policy based on this. And I was frustrated by that. And like, maybe I'm a bad person, but the moment it became mandated is the moment I felt some resistance to that. And then the moment that the Prime Minister of Canada went and took a knee on the front lawn of the Parliament in Canada among thousands of people in a protest, the day before, having said that we all need to stay at home and social distance, is also the moment I thought this is out the window. This is all now political and it's nonsense. I'd like to come back to Steve's sort of hypothetical scenario there about the cost. And so, by the way, I'm getting a low battery signal in my earpiece. So guys, let me know if you stop hearing me and I'll just change to another microphone. But we won't know the cost of this for another decade or 2 decades. There's a 91-year-old man that my mother just told me about, and he is deathly afraid because he has come down with pneumonia. And the reason he has pneumonia, or the reason we could conclude that he's come down with pneumonia, is because of his inactivity. When he could get out, and he used to walk regularly, he would go to the nearby rec center and he would do a few laps around the running track, and he would do that every single day. And now he can't, and he hasn't been doing it for months. And my reaction to this story is that the lockdown is going to kill this man. And there will be fallout like that for decades to come from this the massive unemployment. I think the cost benefit of this is not discussed enough, let's say. And we have journalists that are hyper focused on, and maybe Todd, you can shed some light on why, your study of human communication. We have journalists intensely focused on chasing this ambulance, and everyone is afraid and not looking at the issue pragmatically. Now, maybe someone's going to watch this and say I'm an evil person because the word pragmatic implies perhaps that we should not lock down. We should not be doing everything politically possible to keep people in their homes and away from spreading this virus. And some people are going to have an emotional reaction to that and call me a bad person. But I think those people are, whoever, and I'm using a general they here, but whoever it is that feels that way to my statement about pragmatism, I feel they're not taking into account the fallout and the negative impacts societally, economically, even medically. People missing their diagnoses. There are people right now that are soon dying of cancer, and they've not had a diagnosis, or they missed their MRI. It was postponed for 8 months, and now they're going to. Sorry, I'm ranting, but over to you, Todd.
Yeah, no, if I could, there's again a lot to go through there. So what you were just talking about, though, that's why I say there's no easy answers to this, because you open it up and people will get sick, and there are known long-term effects from this virus, even for the majority who survive it. There's some evidence that it ages the heart up. I saw a study that said it ages the heart up to 10 years if you've had the virus, even if you didn't go to the hospital, just if you've had it. And so does that mean then we're going to see a rash of 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds in the hospital having heart attacks, whereas before they would have been 60, 70 years old before their first heart attack? Now it's 40 to 50 years old. So the downsides that you mentioned to the lockdown and to the mitigative efforts are very real, and they're very heartbreaking. And there are very real downsides to having it open. And that's just a truth and a reality that we all have to accept. That there's no easy answer. As I said before, I oppose lockdowns currently. I don't think there's a reason to have a lockdown. And I can certainly go into that some more if you'd like. But going to the media and the way this is presented, what the media and what communicators thrive on is attention. They need clicks, they need views, they need eyeballs on them reading their articles and watching their videos, and nothing creates attention more so than tension, than disagreement, than anger. That's why your soap operas, it's all drama. Nobody wants to watch a boring movie. We want to watch the dramatic movies. And so the way that, especially in recent years, the way that things have been spun up is to think of things in terms of one side or the other. There's two sides. But that's not the case. You can be pro-mask and anti-lockdown. Living, breathing proof of that. We don't have to fall into this dichotomy of it can only be one way or the other way. There's plenty of room for compromise. There is no perfect solution, because people are going to die from this virus that if we had done more mitigation, they wouldn't have died. People are going to die from the mitigative effects that if we hadn't had them, they wouldn't have died. Or at least they're going to suffer. There's going to be suffering that wouldn't have happened no matter what we do.
Do either of you think that in this past year that the political strife has been exacerbated by lockdowns? And what I mean is, very simply, we saw riots, we saw violence like we've never seen in my lifetime, and in North America, I mean. And what if 70, 85% of those participants were employed during the year, through the year? What if they hadn't been unemployed and their businesses shut down and their jobs on, if they hadn't been furloughed for those months? Would we have seen the same activity in protest? I mean...
No, I think that's one of the myriad of effects that Todd just talked about. I mean, you've got. I mean,
it's like a mental health problem in a kettle, just boiling. I worried about that when I saw it start. When I thought, well, maybe one of the answers to these early riots and protests might have been open the economy and get everyone back to work. But no one was listening to me at the time.
Well,
sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Well, no, this goes right to the heart of why I was interested in starting this podcast. We're an hour and 26 minutes into this podcast, and I kind of feel bad for anyone who's watching it. I'm like, how boring and how pedantic, like just on and diving into these little tangents and unpacking all this information. And the reality is, we haven't even scratched the surface of all of the complication and nuance that is involved with this. I mean, it's the biggest cost benefit analysis and problem and issue of our age, certainly of this decade, and we'll see, maybe it's of the century. And it just, there's so much complexity, and yet, like Todd mentioned, if it bleeds, it leads. We got to garner clicks, we got to sell ad space, and so people are being fed information in little sound bites, and it's not a good basis to try and form an opinion. And so we've seen this just horrible polarization. And part of that, David, I would agree, socially isolating, socially distancing, being at home, not going to concerts, not being as interactive with humanity as we're used to being, I think exacerbates that, because then our only social outlet is social media, which that is just a powder keg. It's just a way to double down on that divisiveness. And these conversations, like when we start our podcast and we say good society is based on good conversations, we have to get back somehow to this level of communication. And it's a bunch of hard, boring work, and it doesn't sell. So what's the solution? Like, how are we going to move the needle? Because when COVID started, I fell to the right of the political spectrum a little bit and said, I don't like the idea of just mandating a whole bunch of measures and then people shaming me about not wearing a mask and not standing too close to them or whatever. And then I fell right in, and every piece of evidence that I could get to bolster my opinion of that, it just took me further and further. And finally, I got to a point where I said, this isn't helping anymore. And now I'm starting to run out of excuses for the people who are surrounding me on social media and some of the things they're saying. And I would say the excess death research that I did was where I really started to say, there is, on the opposite side of that political spectrum, there is a whole bunch of lying and hyperbole going on. But guess what? There's just as much on the side that I purport to be in favor of. And the reality is, if I sit down and have a logical conversation, I'm somewhere much closer to the middle when it comes down to, because it's hard to refute most of what Todd's just explained. I've learned a lot about how the virus actually works, and I'm already thinking a little differently about masks and several things. And but I'm not going to just give up my major concerns about lockdowns and government mandates and the handling of things. So sorry, man, you could just
Todd,
go on and on and on and on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Todd, do you want to pick up there, or I have a question
So,
for you?
well, I want to kind of address, you were talking about the powder keg of emotion that's kind of pent up. And I would just have this to say, that it didn't have to be this way, at least not nearly this bad. I think the fact that this occurred in an American election year really exacerbated the problem, because everything, especially in an election year, but even lately, even non-election years, everything has to be politicized. And certain people politicize something that should never have been politicized. In my opinion, science should never be politicized. There are political policies that need to be crafted around scientific principles and scientific ideas. But to say that science is on one side or the other is ridiculous. Science doesn't have a political party. Science is the search for truth, and it uses observable fact to get there at a slow pace, admittedly, but that's what it does. So it didn't have to be this way.
Truth in a. I know you're being specific with the use of that term. That's a whole nother conversation about the search for truth.
Right.
But so you've raised a good point here about science has been politicized in this past year. I wonder, like, we didn't talk this evening about things like ivermectin or vitamin D and I'm going to say a bad word here, but hydrochloroquine or these other treatments. Like we didn't talk about those other things, but why didn't we talk about those? Is vaccine the only way forward? In fact, my question to you was going to be like, so how do we get through this? How do we go forward, either, in your opinion, politically, medically, etc.?
Well, politically, and this is not just with the coronavirus, but with everything, we need to get on the same team again. And then that's where, looking at the human communication, looking at the communication, the rhetoric that has been put forth regarding masks, regarding the hydroxychloroquine, regarding a lot of these things has just been pure poison. And like I said, it's not just coronavirus. You see the same politicization around global warming, around gender identity. Science has been way too politicized for way too long, unnecessarily. I think with better communication, we could have been in a much better place right now, both economically and medically, with a more cohesive plan and better rhetoric from the beginning. We could be doing a lot better than we're doing on both sides. And I think there's a way to navigate our way forward that minimizes harm on both sides. But it's going to take the political will to admit when you're wrong, to admit maybe just because somebody is a member of a certain party or another, they're correct. And that's a big problem that we have, is listening to who's talking and not what they're saying. We don't listen to what they say. We just listen to who it is that's saying it.
Almost and then a religious faith in the leader of your choice or of your party. It's a very bizarre, very bizarre.
Can you repeat that, Todd? I haven't heard it stated exactly that way, but I think I'm in love with that statement. Listen to what is being said, not to who is saying it. And it's a fun game that you see online sometimes, where they'll do these kind of gotcha videos. You see the late night shows or whatever will do gotcha videos where they will play a quote from Barack Obama, but they make the person think it's from Donald Trump. Yeah.
And depending on what your political affiliation is, you either fervently agree or fervently disagree. And then when it comes to the reality that, oh no, it was the other guy that said it, suddenly you see the cognitive dissonance, just like a racquetball in people's head.
Yeah.
But the one other thing I wanted to mention, this is going back a little bit to when we were talking about mandates and Steve's reluctance to adhere to a mandate. And this is maybe my take-home message, is it should be irrelevant. It should never get to the point of needing a mandate, because we know what the right things to do are. And so we just need to do them. The government doesn't need to tell us. We don't need the government to tell us what to do. But if they're saying something, it's because their scientists say that that's the right way to do it. So I'll put an example out there of the speed limit and turning your lights on at night. So there's laws that say you've got to travel a certain speed, and when it's nighttime, you've got to have your lights on. Well, the government can't tell me to do that. So am I going to go tearing down the freeway 120 miles an hour with my lights off through deer country or moose country Is that a very smart thing to do? Do I need the government to really tell me not to do that? No, I don't. It's common sense. And so to me, that's what these mitigative efforts are, is common sense. Now, again, I'm setting lockdowns aside from the mitigative efforts. When
Thank
I
you.
say mitigation, I mean mitigation that allows us to keep our economy open. And that's going to keep the economy open, and it's going to reduce as much as possible the transmission of the virus. So wear a dang mask, not because the government tells you, but because it's just common sense. It's the same reason why I don't smoke cigarettes. It's the same reason why I don't drink alcohol. It's the same reason why I don't drive down the freeway 120 miles an hour with my lights off, because
Yeah.
it's just common sense. We know from the science that it works. What the politicians say to me is irrelevant. Socially distance, wash your hands, do the things that the scientists have done the studies on that show, hey, these things reduce spread.
I'm glad you're repeating some of these things. And it was our previous guest, Kimberly, that reminded me that in last March and early April, and you repeated it this evening, that actually some businesses, some social environments, let's say, took the proactive step of mandating a mask indoors in their retail store, or airlines were starting to shut down some flights out of Wuhan, China, or out of Italy where there were hotspots, like Air Canada here, before any government said stop the border or close the border. They were voluntarily taking some of these steps because they knew that that's what their consumers wanted, that they wanted their customer base to know that they were being responsible. Like I said earlier, I bought masks and I was wearing masks voluntarily. I think there's a somebody in government, many people in government, has misjudged, I feel, the population, and the politicians in general have taken that choice away from the citizenry. They've decided to mandate this as law, as martial law. In fact, like in Ontario, we have again a second official state of emergency. I don't think these measures were necessary to force the population to do these things. I think if none of these measures were mandated by lawful or by enforcement, legal enforcement, many people would be doing it anyways. Sure, there would be some that would not. My hypothesis is that that would be a negligible percentage of people. And but maybe I'm naive. So I agree with mitigation efforts. I agree that mandating it by government was the wrong move.
So I'll add one more thing.
Maybe I'm disagreeing. Sorry, I said I agree, assuming that you both agree.
So I've heard, this is again kind of a vague they statement, so I apologize, but I've heard a lot of references to, it starts with masks and then it goes from there. They can't tell me to wear a mask because I'm going to be wearing this mask for forever. When does it end? I myself just said earlier that I don't think the coronavirus is going to go away anytime soon, if ever. So are we going to have to wear masks for forever? Well, I'll just say in 1918 with the Spanish flu, there were mask mandates. There were shutdowns. And they ended. There is a point where, and this ties into the science, where there's that latent immunity that we can achieve to where it's not as big of a threat as it is right now. And what that point is, well, that's up for debate as to what exactly what threshold that is. But there is a threshold there to where I can say with some degree of confidence, we're not going to be wearing masks for forever. If we're still wearing masks in 2022, I would be shocked. If we're still wearing masks by Christmas of 2021, I'd be shocked, or even by the fall of 2021, I'd be shocked. So I don't see public health advice as some master government plan to take over the world, to make you do things for the heck of it. I mean, maybe if the government had, somebody in the government, say the president or somebody, has stock in a mask company, then there might be something nefarious going on there. But that's not the case. You can make your own mask out of an old T-shirt. There's nothing to gain from government officials telling you wear a mask other than it's for your own good, based on the studies that our government epidemiologists have conducted and or read and or participated in. This is what we need to do to slow down the transmission level of the virus in our community, to improve our medical health, while at the same time enabling our economic health to be as good as it can be for now.
Okay,
So
that
I don't
statement
see
can
it.
be true, while it's all. Would you also agree it's true that some politicians have been opportunistic in this moment to
Without a
advance
doubt.
policies that they would otherwise never get away with, or that they would have to go through regular procedure and it probably would get stalled or stopped?
Yep.
Okay.
Never let a good crisis go to waste. Politicians, they never let a good crisis go to waste. So they are absolutely doing that. And so how do you parse out, okay, what's a good idea versus what is the government just making up to advance whatever interests they may have? And that's difficult to do, admittedly. But to me, wearing a mask I don't see how that furthers some government official's agenda to get me to make my own mask out of an old T-shirt and wear it around whenever I go to the store. It's not that big of a hassle. It's not hard to do. It's not a big inconvenience. It doesn't benefit anybody other than me and the people in my immediate vicinity. Now, but that being said, like you said, are there other things that they may be doing to take advantage of this crisis? Absolutely. So I listen to the scientists. I don't really listen to the politicians. I don't take scientific advice from a politician. Sometimes they say the same thing. And maybe that's what I'm trying to get at here. Sometimes there's overlap there, and it's okay for there to be overlap. But if a scientist is saying something different, or if the scientific community is saying something different than what a politician is saying, I'm going to side with the scientist every time.
Unless it's not allowed. Like, there are scientists, yourself included tonight, have said schools are probably a safer environment. I think your exact phrase was the risks are less than the benefits. And yet,
Yep.
in my province, the law prevents me from allowing my children into the schools.
Yep.
And I disagree with this. I think the law is, in fact, it's not even a law, to be truthful. It's a order, and whether it's even constitutional is still up for debate, and our courts will hopefully rule on that. But right now we have politicians, like I said earlier, acting as though the science is settled. And I'd rather that locally we look more carefully at what scientists are in fact saying, and they're saying kids should be in school.
Yep.
That's just one
Sign
example.
Sign me up for your protest to put my name on the petition to open up schools.
Good.
Because I'm there, because that's what the science is saying. Also put me on the petition to get you to wear your mask whenever you leave the house. Both things can be true.
Wait.
Yeah.
Do you mean outdoors when I leave my house?
If it's colder weather and you're going to be close to other people, yeah.
No, I live in a suburb, and there's I go for a walk. I see one other human with a dog, and if a government official decides that I need to be wearing a mask outdoors, there's just no way I'm going to do that.
No,
That
so
seems
again,
to me crazy.
It doesn't matter what the government says to me. But I understand what you're saying. They're saying this and they're making it law. So, yeah, there's what we should do and what we have to do. So things that we should do are wear masks when we're out in public. So when you're out by yourself on a trail, no, you don't need to wear a mask. Of course not. Now, if you're going to be passing somebody who's out walking his dog and you're going to get within 6 feet, it might not hurt to have a mask in your pocket to pull it out and put it over your face. I say that not because the government says that's what you should do, but because that's the best way to reduce transmission of a potentially lethal virus. So, the government mandates or whatever, to me, are somewhat irrelevant, because it's what does the science say? And where government diverges from what the science says, you bet, sign me up, I'm there.
Yeah.
Should kids be in school? You bet, kids should be in school. Should you wear your mask when you go to the store? You bet you should wear your mask when you go to the store. Does it matter if there's a mask mandate or not? Nope. Where we are right now in Utah, there's a mask mandate. There has been for about, what's it been, Steve? About 3 months. Before that, there was no mask mandate. I've been wearing a mask every time I go to the store, whether there's a mandate or not. Doesn't matter to me. But where government starts to step on toes, which they like to do, you better believe that I'm right there with you.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Todd. You've achieved two firsts in our podcast tonight. One is by a pretty distinct margin. This is the longest time we've spent with a guest.
I'm sorry, everyone.
And two, you've proved our third tenet of our podcast, and that is, as I've had a chance, this is a much more involved discussion than I've ever had with you, even though we knew each other prior. And I have a sense that there are several points in which I completely disagree with you. And yet I really couldn't imagine having more respect for you than I do. I just appreciate so much your willingness to just express yourself in an honest and heartfelt way, and to have patience with me and with David as we express our thoughts, and just to engage in the conversation and try to make some kind of small dent in finding some common ground and in learning from each other. I just really, really appreciate you.
Well, thank you. And just may I say, what you guys are doing is the exact remedy that we need right now. This is what we need, is open, honest discourse, where we can discuss ideas and not just, as I said before, who's saying it, well, then I must agree with whoever it is that's saying whatever they're saying based on who they are. We can have ideas that cross political lines, and that maybe not everything needs a political line. Yeah. So my hat's off to you guys. This is a great venture that you guys are undertaking. I apologize for the time.
I
could do 4 more of these episodes.
Don't apologize. No.
Well, we may invite you back sooner than later, because I think there's a lot of subjects we could have some interesting dialogue on. So,
yeah.
But
I'll say my part too, Todd. It's been really nice to have met you, Steve. I thank you for inviting Todd to join us for conversation. I think we could have much more conversation. I do feel there's probably areas where you and I would disagree on the extent to which we should go along with these mandates and so forth. But having said that, there's a few things you need to know now before you leave. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you off of our screen. And then Steve and I are going to carry on just a brief conversation as we reflect on the conversation that we've had. When I take you off screen, just be aware you're still heard. So you could either mute and stick around and listen, or you can mute and then just exit the meeting, and we'll hopefully catch up with you in the future and talk again. Todd, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity, guys. Thanks.
All right.
Okay. Good night.
Steve, we have another first this evening. My earpiece ran out of battery, so I have to make sure if we're going to have conversations this long, I have to be better prepared.
So you switched mid stream there?
Kind of. What's happening here is that my computer is, I'm just listening with a speaker very quietly.
Oh.
And it's probably not so loud that it's coming through my lapel mic. So
okay.
We're
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, there's no change in quality, so that's good.
Okay. So that was a nice conversation. I was worried that I would maybe disagree more with him than I found. I wonder if I've changed a little. Like, I've gone out without a mask to stores where I know there are mandates to wear a mask, And as you said, almost in dissent, not almost, precisely in dissent. And he's made me wonder if, am I just being stubborn unnecessarily? So I'll have to think more carefully on that. But I might have changed a little here.
Yeah. I found out that I actually am just a complete sociopath, because I used to have I had a 2018 Mercedes CLA,
Yeah.
and when there was a full moon, I really enjoyed going out on an empty highway, and I try and get it up to about 110, 120, and turn the lights off, and just, that was pretty cool. So
Yeah.
maybe I just have a streak of rebelliousness.
That is interesting, though. Like the speed limit comparison is interesting. Everyone by now has seen the data. We know that wearing a seatbelt and driving at reasonable speeds prevents death, prevents our own death, and it prevents the death of passengers in our own vehicle and fatalities in other vehicles. We know that as people increase their speeds and don't wear the seatbelts, fatalities increase dramatically. That data alone, those data alone, I think have largely convinced people, even the most stubborn of us, that we should just do it. Speed limits, however, are not enforced with the same kind of martial response that we're seeing to masking these days. Like, there are people being tackled in a shopping mall and arrested by 5 police officers in fact, he was wearing a mask. It was just that he took his mask down while in the food court, while he was eating something. And this is an example recently in Ontario, in Newmarket. So that's the response for not wearing a mask. Meanwhile, we've got people driving on the 401, literally 140 kilometers an hour, 150 kilometers an hour, and that's okay, Or there's one police cruiser sitting at the side of the road, probably near Woodstock, between London and Toronto. Meanwhile, there's police up and down the streets of Montreal tonight with their sirens on. Like, we're just out of balance completely.
Yeah. I think I used to make that early on in the pandemic, and as we're in social media and stuff, I would talk about speed limits a lot, because I think it's a fairly reasonable comparison. But the difference is, to be fair, speed limits, and that's been a slow progression of changes and slight tweaks to what that limit should be. And as seatbelts have gotten better, and car safety has gotten better, and the roads have gotten better, and just so many different things, that's slowly been an evolutionary process over a lot of years. Whereas, you could make the argument possibly, it's like, well, we don't know what's going to happen with COVID, so the speed limit is 20 everywhere. It's just what we're going to do until we know different. And it's like, well, is that a reasonable approach? And I think Todd makes a good point when he says there is no easy answers, and politicians are in some. I think there's been some reasonably good politicians, and there's been some reasonably bad politicians as far as approaches and
he said a couple of times, and I really appreciated that he reiterated his position on lockdowns in the present moment. It's an unpopular opinion, it appears online. Like, if you were to go to Twitter right now and you say, we should protect the vulnerable and use reasonable mitigation efforts like social distancing and masking, and we should open the economy, you might as well have started a social media platform called Parlor. You know, like you're an evil, cruel human if you say something like that out loud, it seems. And I think the response to that is so, it's one of the problems we have in conversation in this we're just not having enough dialogue, and I really appreciate Todd coming to talk with us to have dialogue and have reasonable dialogue, and we need to have more reasonable dialogue. So I was glad that he shares that position with me. I certainly share that position.
Yep. No. Well, it's been a long conversation, but a good one, and we got.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it.
I have to put my foot down at 2 hours, though.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. When the batteries are dying on my earpiece, that should be a sign. So how about we close it up? Yeah.
Yeah, sounds
Right.
great.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Those
Thank
that
you
have
so much.
tuned in.
I'm going to have this video uploaded to YouTube probably tomorrow sometime. Check us out at locals.com. You'll find us in our community there called fundamentalfreedoms.locals.com. There aren't many people there yet, but I think it's a platform that could be really interesting in future. So please join and let's make it into something unique. Until then, Steve, so nice to talk with you again. Thanks very much for doing all this.
Thank you. And thank you.
Okay.